Devil's Tramping Ground, a mysterious circle in the forests of North Carolina, had always intrigued me. For years, I'd heard stories of its eerie nature, how nothing ever grew within its boundaries, and how any object left there overnight would be violently moved by morning. My name is Dr. Henry Blackwood, a researcher in paranormal phenomena, and I decided it was time to unravel this mystery once and for all. Armed with equipment, a tent, and an unwavering curiosity, I set out to spend a night in the legendary circle. I arrived at the site just before dusk. The forest surrounding the circle was dense and alive with the sounds of nature. But the circle itself, about 40 feet in diameter, was eerily silent. No crickets chirped, no birds sang. It was as if nature itself was wary of this place. The ground was barren, a stark contrast to the lush greenery just outside its perimeter. I pitched my tent at the center, setting up cameras and sensors around the circle to capture any movement or changes during the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a sense of unease settled over me. I tried to dismiss it as mere anticipation, but the silence within the circle was unnerving. I busied myself with final preparations, checking the batteries on my equipment and ensuring everything was in place. With everything set, I sat down with my notebook to record my initial observations. The temperature within the circle was notably cooler, and the stillness was almost oppressive. Night fell quickly, and the forest around me became a dark, impenetrable wall. My flashlight cast long, eerie shadows, making the trees seem like ghostly figures watching from the edges of the circle. I forced myself to focus on my notes, jotting down every detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed. Hours passed, and aside from the unnatural silence and occasional rustle in the bushes, nothing happened. I began to question the tales I'd heard. Maybe it was all just superstition. Around midnight, the atmosphere changed. A cold breeze swept through the circle, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The temperature dropped suddenly, and a dense fog began to form at the edges of the circle, slowly creeping inward. I watched, fascinated and terrified, as the fog thickened, obscuring the forest, and then the equipment I'd set up. The world outside the circle vanished, leaving me in an isolated bubble of cold and silence. My heart pounded in my chest as I checked my cameras. They were all malfunctioning, screens filled with static. Panic began to set in, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was what I'd come for, after all. I needed to document everything. I turned my attention to my notebook, but before I could write anything down, a low growl echoed through the circle. I froze, straining my ears to pinpoint the source. The growl came again, closer this time, vibrating through the ground beneath me. Suddenly, my tent was violently ripped open, and a force unseen threw me across the circle. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my side. My flashlight skidded away, leaving me in darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and I felt a presence, something ancient and malevolent, closing in on me. I grabbed my flashlight, its weak beam cutting through the fog just enough to reveal shadows moving around me. Shapes that were not quite human, yet not entirely beastly. In a moment of clarity, I realized that whatever was here, it didn't want me. I backed toward the edge of the circle, every instinct screaming at me to run. As I reached the boundary, an icy hand gripped my ankle, pulling me back. I kicked frantically, breaking free and stumbled out of the circle. The fog dissipated almost instantly, and the sounds of the forest returned. Panting and shaking, I glanced back at the circle. It was empty, silent as before. I didn't stay to gather my equipment. I fled through the forest, not stopping until I reached my car. I locked the doors and drove away, my mind struggling to process what had happened. The cameras were ruined, the sensors destroyed. All I had were my notes and the haunting memory of that night. I never returned to the Devil's Tramping Ground. Some mysteries, I decided, are better left unsolved. I've spent most of my life chasing stories that others would laugh off, delving into the myths and legends that cling to the darker corners of the world. It's what I do. I research the paranormal, the unexplained, the things that go bump in the night. Skeptics call it a fool's errand, but I've seen and heard enough to know there's more out there than we can rationally explain. That's why, when I first heard about the Devil's Tramping Ground, I knew I had to experience it for myself. The stories were well known in certain circles, but if you're not familiar, the Devil's Tramping Ground is a small, barren circle in the woods of North Carolina. No vegetation grows there, animals avoid it, and anything left in the circle overnight is found moved to the outside by morning. Local lore says that it's where the devil himself comes to walk in circles, thinking of new ways to bring evil into the world. They say nothing stays inside the circle because the devil doesn't allow it. I decided to spend the night there, not just because it made for an intriguing story, but because I wanted to see if the legends were true. Was there something really unnatural about this place? Or was it all just superstition? I packed a tent, some basic supplies, a camera to document everything, and my journal to take notes. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I made my way into the woods. The trail wasn't hard to find. There were clear signs that others had come this way before me. But as I got closer, a peculiar sensation crept over me. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but more like a feeling of being watched. The kind of tingling on the back of your neck that tells you something is out of place. I shook it off, attributing it to my overactive imagination, and pressed on. When I reached the clearing, it was exactly as described. A perfect circle of barren earth, roughly 40 feet in diameter. The trees surrounding it were thick, their branches forming a natural barrier that seemed to cage the emptiness within. The ground was firm, hard-packed, and lifeless. Not a single blade of grass, or even a weed, marked the surface. It was unsettling in a way I hadn't anticipated. Setting up my tent just outside the circle, I decided to leave my equipment inside it, directly in the center of the tramping ground. If anything moved, I wanted to capture it on camera. As night fell, the air grew cooler, and the sounds of the forest around me began to change. The usual rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, all of it seemed to stop, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I sat outside my tent for a while, staring at the circle. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. I tried to write in my journal, but found that I couldn't concentrate. Every time I glanced up, I felt as though the circle had somehow changed, though I couldn't put my finger on what was different. It was the same empty patch of earth, but something about it felt wrong, as if it was pulsing with an energy I couldn't see. Midnight came and went without incident. to relax, thinking that maybe this would just be another night of chasing shadows. That's when the wind picked up. It wasn't a strong wind, but it was enough to set the trees swaying, their branches creaking ominously. The temperature dropped sharply, and a low hum filled the air. It started as a barely perceptible vibration in my ears, but it grew louder, becoming a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from all around me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the circle, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness at its center. No matter how hard I tried to focus, the middle of the circle remained an impenetrable void. I stepped closer, the light in my hand shaking, the weather from the cold or fear, I couldn't tell. Suddenly, the wind stopped, the hum ceased, and there was silence, absolute and complete. Not a single sound, not even the rustle of leaves. I could hear my own heartbeat, rapid and frantic. Then I saw it. The ground in the center of the circle began to move. At first, it was just a faint ripple, like something shifting beneath the earth. But it quickly grew more pronounced. The soil bulged upward, as if something was trying to break through. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was as if the air itself had thickened, holding me in place. I could only watch in horror as a figure began to rise from the ground, its form slowly taking shape in the moonlight. It wasn't human, not entirely. It stood taller than any man, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted. Its skin was dark, almost black, and it shimmered as though it was covered in oil. But it was the eyes that paralyzed me. Two burning orbs of red, glowing with an intense, malevolent light. The figure stepped forward, out of the circle, and the ground beneath it seemed to hiss, as if recoiling from its presence. It was then that I realized the truth. This wasn't just a story, a legend told by the locals to scare the gullible. This was real, and I was in way over my head. The creature spoke, its voice low and guttural, like the rumbling of distant thunder. It didn't use words, not in the way we do, but I understood it all the same. It was anger, malice, and hunger, all rolled into one. I knew, in that moment, that I was standing before something ancient, something that had walked the earth long before humans had ever set foot here. It took another step toward me, and I finally broke free of whatever force had held me in place. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body was slow to respond. I tripped over a root, falling hard on my back. The creature loomed over me, its shadow engulfing me, and I could feel its gaze boring into my soul. Just when I thought it was over, the creature paused. Its head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only it could hear. Then, with a final glance, it turned and stepped back into the circle. The ground trembled as it sank beneath the earth, and within moments, the tramping ground was as empty as it had been when I arrived. I didn't wait for morning. I gathered my things as quickly as I could and ran, not caring about the noise I made, not caring about anything except putting as much distance between myself and that place as possible. When I finally reached my car, I didn't look back. I drove straight home, my heart pounding the entire way. That was the last time I went looking for stories. Some things are better left unexplored, better left to the darkness. I still have my journal from that night, though I haven't opened it since. Whatever I saw in the devil's tramping ground, it wasn't meant for this world, or for any world I'd want to be a part of. began as a research project, just another experiment in my long list of psychological studies that bordered on the paranormal. I've always been a skeptic, a man of science. I don't believe in ghosts, demons, or any other supernatural nonsense. I've spent my career debunking the so-called mysteries of the world, exposing charlatans and frauds. So, when I first heard about the Devil's Tramping Ground, I was intrigued, not by the folklore, but by the potential for discovery. I thought I could finally put to rest one of North Carolina's most enduring legends. The stories said that the Devil's Tramping Ground was a barren circle in the woods, about 40 feet in diameter, where nothing ever grew. No animals would enter the circle, and no vegetation would take root. Legend had it that the devil himself walked this circle at night, plotting his next act of evil, trampling the ground barren with his infernal footsteps. Those who dared to spend the night in the circle either went mad or were never heard from again. I wasn't one to be deterred by superstition. My plan was simple. Spend the night in the circle, document my experiences, and prove once and for all that there was nothing supernatural about this place. I packed my equipment, a high-resolution camera, a voice recorder, an EMF meter, and a notebook. I brought along my sleeping bag, a tent, and enough food and water to last me the night. I even packed a flask of whiskey, planning to celebrate my victory over the unknown when dawn broke. The drive to Chatham County was uneventful, but as I approached the area, an unsettling sense of isolation settled over me. The road narrowed into a dirt path, flanked by dense woods. The sky, once a bright expanse of blue, had dimmed to a somber gray, as though the sun itself was retreating from what lay ahead. By the time I arrived at the Devil's Tramping Ground, dusk was already creeping in, casting long shadows through the trees. The circle was exactly as described, an eerie patch of bare earth surrounded by towering trees and thick underbrush. No grass grew within the perimeter. The soil was dark, almost black, as if it had been scorched. I scanned the area with my equipment, noting nothing out of the ordinary. The EMF meter was quiet, and the camera captured nothing but the stark contrast between the vibrant forest and the desolate circle. I pitched my tent right in the center of the circle, defiantly staking my claim in the devil's domain. As the last light of day faded, I built a small fire just outside my tent, the flames dancing in the encroaching darkness. I ate a simple meal, washing it down with a swig of whiskey, and then settled in for the night. I recorded a brief log entry, noting the time and my initial impressions. For hours, nothing happened. The woods were silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. My fire crackled softly, its light casting flickering shadows that seemed to play tricks on my eyes. I was beginning to feel foolish. What was I expecting? The devil himself to make an appearance? I chuckled to myself, feeling the alcohol warm my belly. This would be the easiest debunking yet. Midnight came and went without incident. I was starting to nod off when the fire suddenly died down, as though snuffed out by an unseen hand. I sat up, my heart pounding, and reached for the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty woods. I felt a chill, though the air was warm. There was a weight to the atmosphere now, a sense of presence that hadn't been there before. I grabbed the EMF meter and swept it around the circle. The needle spiked, the device emitting a high-pitched whine. My rational mind scrambled for an explanation. Perhaps there was a buried power line or some natural magnetic field. But I knew the area was remote, far from any infrastructure. I took out my voice recorder and began asking questions, my voice steady, despite the unease gnawing at my gut. "Is anyone here with me?" I asked. The silence was absolute. "What do you want?" I played back the recording, listening intently. At first, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. But then, beneath it, I heard something. A low, guttural growl, so faint I could barely make it out. My skin prickled with goosebumps. The sound didn't belong to any animal I knew of. Before I could react, the temperature plummeted. My breath fogged the air, and the ground beneath me seemed to vibrate, almost imperceptibly at first, then more violently. It was as if something massive was pacing just beneath the Earth's surface, its footfalls resonating through the soil. I shone the flashlight around frantically. The circle was still empty, but the shadows at the edge of the woods seemed to writhe, coalescing into shapes that didn't belong in this world. Twisted, hulking figures that loomed just beyond the reach of the light. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet and falling hard onto the cold earth. The figures didn't move closer, but their presence was oppressive, their forms constantly shifting, never fully materializing. My mind raced, torn between the urge to flee and the need to document what I was experiencing. I grabbed the camera, snapping photos in rapid succession, though I could hardly keep my hands steady. A voice broke through the darkness, soft at first, then rising in a chorus of whispers, unintelligible but undeniably malevolent. The sound surrounded me, coming from all directions, as though the very air was alive with malice. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the voices only grew louder, drilling into my skull, threatening to unravel my sanity. In a moment of sheer panic, I bolted for the tent, diving inside and zipping it shut behind me. I curled into a ball, clutching the camera to my chest, the voices now a cacophony outside. The ground continued to tremble, the rhythm of the unseen footsteps growing more frenzied. My pulse pounded in my ears, each beat louder than the last, until it drowned out everything else. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear. The voices eventually subsided, replaced by an eerie silence that was somehow worse. The tremors ceased, leaving the ground cold and still. I dared to peek out of the tent, half expecting to see the figure still standing there, watching. But the circle was empty, as if nothing had ever been there at all. The night dragged on, and though the phenomena didn't return, the fear lingered, clinging to me like a second skin. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was tainted by the knowledge that something had happened, something I couldn't explain. I packed up my gear with trembling hands, not bothering to eat or drink. I wanted nothing more than to get out of that place, to leave the devil's tramping ground behind, and never speak of it again. But as I loaded the last of my equipment into the car, I couldn't resist one final look at the circle. It was just as I had found it, barren, lifeless, and seemingly ordinary. Yet, I knew better now. The Devil's Tramping Ground wasn't just a legend. It was a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where something ancient and malevolent still walked. I drove away, vowing to never return. But as I sped down the dirt road, I couldn't couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't leaving alone, that something had followed me, a shadow lurking just beyond my sight, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The photos I took were all corrupted, the images warped and distorted beyond recognition. The voice recorder, too, was a mess of static, with only that faint growl remaining. I never published my findings, never published a word of what I had experienced. I had gone to the devil's tramping ground to debunk a myth, to prove to the world that there was nothing to fear in that barren circle. Instead, I left with a fear that gnawed at my every